My son texted, "Sorry, but you're not invited for Christmas. You'll celebrate alone. Go away." I silently smiled and left and made a call. 3 days later, my son called me in panic. 22 missed calls. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that the holidays were the one thing that could never be taken from you. My name is Margaret Holloway. Most people who love me call me Peggy. And for 68 years, I believed that family was the one investment that always paid dividends. My late husband Harold would have laughed at that, the way I put everything in accounting terms. "Peggy," he'd say, leaning back in his armchair with that slow smile of his, "not everything has a balance sheet." Maybe he was right. But then again, Harold never lived long enough to see what our son became. I raised Danny in a yellow house on Birchwood Lane in Fairfield, Connecticut. 3 bedrooms, a porch that needed painting every 5 years, and a backyard where Harold built a tire swing that outlasted our marriage by 12 years. I worked as a senior bookkeeper for Caldwell and Associates for over 2 decades. And when Harold passed from a heart attack in 2011, I managed the estate, settled the debts, and kept the house. All on my own. I was not a woman who fell apart. I was a woman who made lists. Danny was our only child, and I poured everything into him. College tuition, paid in full. His first car, a used Honda Civic, but reliable. His wedding to Christine Patterson in 2007, I contributed $40,000 because Christine's parents offered nothing and Danny looked at me with those eyes, Harold's eyes, and I couldn't say no. I told myself it was love. Looking back, I wonder if it was the first transaction in a very long series. Christine was beautiful in the way that certain flowers are beautiful. Bright, attention-commanding, and quick to wilt if not constantly tended to. She worked as a real estate agent, which suited her. She had a talent for showing people exactly what they wanted to see and hiding everything else. In the early years, I told myself I simply needed to get to know her better. We were different women. That was fine. Not every daughter-in-law becomes a friend. The first cracks appeared so slowly I almost missed them. It started with the Christmas of 2019. I had spent weeks preparing. A glazed ham, my mother's recipe for sweet potato casserole, a hand-knitted sweater for little Oliver, who was 6, and a porcelain tea set for Zoe, who had just turned 3 and already loved pretending to host parties. I arrived at Danny and Christine's home in Westport, a 4-bedroom colonial they'd bought with, among other contributions, a $50,000 loan from me that had quietly stopped being repaid. And Christine met me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're doing things a little differently this year," she said. Differently meant that the dinner was catered. Differently meant that my sweet potato casserole sat untouched on the kitchen counter because Christine had decided the family was going lighter on carbs. Differently meant that Oliver opened his sweater, looked to his mother before reacting, and then set it carefully aside without putting it on. He was 6 years old and already reading his mother's face like a weather report. I smiled. I ate. I drove home alone on the I-95 and told myself it was one dinner, but the pattern continued. Phone calls that went to voicemail, invitations to Oliver's birthday that arrived after the party had already happened. "We sent it to the old email, Mom. So sorry." Christmases that became shorter, then shorter still, until I was allotted 2 hours on December 26th, the day after, when the real celebration was already over. Christine always had a reason, always a scheduling conflict, a prior commitment, a sensible explanation wrapped in polite language that left no room to argue without sounding unreasonable. By 2022, I had given Danny and Christine a total of $93,000. I had kept a ledger. I am a bookkeeper, after all. $40,000 for the wedding, $50,000 toward the house, $3,000 for Danny's dental work when he was between jobs. I kept it not to demand repayment. I kept it because Harold always said, "Write down what matters, so you don't forget what's real." In November of 2023, Danny called to discuss Christmas plans. I assumed we were finally getting back to something normal. Oliver was 10 now. Zoe was 7. The children were old enough to have real memories of their grandmother. I started planning. I bought gifts. I ordered a spiral-cut ham. Then, 3 days before Christmas, a text message appeared on my phone. It was from Danny. But I could hear Christine's voice in every word. "Mom, I'm sorry, but you're not invited to Christmas this year. You'll be celebrating alone. Please don't come." I read it twice, then a third time. I set my phone down on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Danny with his homework for 12 years, and I looked out the window at the snow falling on Birchwood Lane. Then I smiled, and I picked up the phone. Not to call Danny back, I called Richard Byrne, my attorney. That night, I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because there simply wasn't room for tears yet. The hurt was too large to fit through something as small as tears. Instead, I did what I have always done when the world stops making sense. I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I started writing. At the top of the page, I wrote one word: inventory. Because that's what this was, I realized. Not a personal catastrophe, an inventory problem. I had been investing in a relationship that had been quietly liquidating me for years, and I had been so busy trying to keep the account open that I hadn't noticed how much had already been withdrawn. $93,000. I wrote it out in longhand. $93,000. The way Harold used to say you should write out large numbers when you needed to feel their weight. Then I wrote what I had received in return. A daughter-in-law who treated my presence at family events as a scheduling inconvenience. A son who had learned to forward Christine's decisions as if they were his own. 2 grandchildren I was being systematically separated from. And a text message on the 22nd of December telling me that Christmas was no longer mine. The fear came later, around midnight, when the house got very quiet. It was a specific kind of fear, the kind that only people of a certain age understand. Not fear of Christine exactly. Fear of irrelevance? Fear that I had already become a figure in the background of my own family's life, the woman who sent checks and was thanked briefly and forgotten until the next need arose. Fear that if I did nothing, the next 10 years would look exactly like the last 3, except that Oliver and Zoe would grow up believing that Grandma Peggy was simply someone who existed at a distance, who occasionally sent birthday cards and could be managed with polite, brief phone calls. That fear lasted about 40 minutes. Then something shifted. I thought about my mother, Eleanor, who raised 3 children alone after my father left in 1963. She used to say, "The moment you accept that something is too hard to change is the moment it becomes permanent." My mother was not a soft woman. She was a practical one. And she raised me to understand the difference between mourning and strategizing. I poured myself a cup of tea, chamomile, Harold's prescription for difficult evenings, and I sat back down at the table. The legal pad now had 2 columns. On the left, what I had given. On the right, what had been taken beyond the money. And what had been taken, I realized as I wrote, was access. Access to my grandchildren, access to family occasions, Access to the ordinary moments, school plays, Sunday dinners, the small, unremarkable afternoons that accumulate over years into the substance of a relationship. Christine had been conducting a slow, quiet campaign to make me peripheral, and Danny, whether out of conflict avoidance or genuine complicity, had let her. The question was not whether I was angry. I was. The question was what I was going to do with that anger. Whether I was going to let it make me reactive, which would only give Christine ammunition, or whether I was going to let it make me methodical, which was the one thing she would not expect from a 68-year-old woman who baked ham and knitted sweaters. I turned to a fresh page. First, I needed to understand my legal position. I had made significant financial contributions to Danny and Christine's life together. Some of those funds had been framed as gifts, but some had been accompanied by verbal agreements. The $50,000 for the house, specifically, had come with a clear understanding, stated in front of Danny's friend Marcus Webb, who had been present that evening, that it would be repaid within 7 years. 7 years had passed in 2023. Not a dollar had come back. Second, I needed to document the pattern of exclusion, not for emotional reasons, but for practical ones. Connecticut has grandparent visitation statutes. I had looked them up once, years ago after a difficult Christmas, and then told myself I was being dramatic and closed the browser. I was done telling myself I was being dramatic. Third, I needed to stop being the person who absorbed the damage quietly. Every time I had smiled through a slight, I had taught Christine that the slight was acceptable. I had been, in accounting terms, subsidizing bad behavior. I called Richard Byrne the following morning at 8:15. Richard had handled Harold's estate and had known our family for 20 years. I told him, plainly and without excessive emotion, what had happened over the past several years and what I intended to explore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Peggy, I think you should come in. Bring your records." I already had them. That afternoon, I went to my filing cabinet, the gray metal one in the spare bedroom that Christine had once suggested I replace with something more aesthetic. And I pulled out the folder I had labeled years ago, simply family. Receipts, bank transfer records, the birthday cards with dates. A note in Harold's handwriting from 2009 that mentioned Danny's request for money for the down payment. I had everything. Sitting at Richard's desk 2 days later, I watched him read through the documents. His expression didn't change much. Lawyers are trained for that. But at one point he looked up and said, "You kept all of this?" "I'm a bookkeeper," I said. "I keep everything." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That's very good, Peggy." Outside his window, the snow was still falling. Christmas had come and gone without me. Danny had not called. Christine had not called. There were no messages from the grandchildren. The silence was so complete it had its own texture. But I wasn't grieving anymore. I was planning. The first official document was filed on January the 6th, a Tuesday, in the Fairfield County Superior Court. Richard had spent nearly 2 weeks reviewing everything I'd brought him. The transfer records, the bank statements, the correspondence, a timeline I had reconstructed from my personal calendar going back to 2017. His conclusion was careful, but clear. I had grounds to pursue civil action for the recovery of the $50,000 house contribution, based on the verbal loan agreement witnessed by Marcus Webb, who had already agreed, when Richard contacted him, to provide a written statement. Additionally, Connecticut General Statutes Section 46B-59 allowed grandparents to petition for visitation rights when a relationship with a grandchild had been unreasonably denied and when it was in the child's best interest. We were not filing that petition yet, but we were preparing it. Quietly. The first document was simply a formal demand letter, sent by certified mail to Daniel and Christine Holloway at their Westport address, stating that the sum of $50,000 loaned in June of 2016 and verbally agreed to be repaid by June of 2023 remained outstanding and was hereby formally requested within 30 days. I remember standing at the post office on Post Road and handing the envelope to the clerk. My hands were steady. That surprised me a little. I did not tell Danny the letter was coming. I did not warn Christine. I simply sent it, and then I went home and made myself lunch. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, Harold's favorite. And I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something close to calm. The call came 4 days later. Not from Danny, from Christine. She called my cell phone at 10 in the morning on a Saturday, and I let it ring twice before answering, which was exactly one ring longer than I would have in the old days. A small thing, but deliberate. Margaret. She never called me Peggy. It had always been Margaret, the full formal version, which created the impression of respect while actually maintaining distance. We received something from an attorney's office. I know, I said. I sent it. A beat of silence. I could hear her recalibrating in real time. I think there's been some misunderstanding, she said. Danny and I always intended to. The letter explains the terms and the timeline, I said. Richard Burns' number is on the letterhead if you'd like to discuss it further with him directly. This is not. She stopped, started again. This is a very aggressive way to approach a family matter. It's a standard legal remedy for an outstanding debt, I said. I hope you have a good day, Christine. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, not from fear, from the unaccustomed sensation of having done exactly what I intended to do without apologizing for it. 2 days later, Doris Kaminsky called me. Doris had been my closest friend since we met in a watercolor class in 2014 after Harold passed. She was 71, sharp as a letter opener, and had been watching my situation with Danny and Christine for years with an expression she reserved for things she found both troubling and unsurprising. I heard from Linda Marsh, she said, who heard from her daughter, who works in the same real estate office as Christine. Apparently, Christine has been telling colleagues that you're going through something and that the family is handling it sensitively. I wrote that down. Not because it was legally significant, because it was a data point. Christine was already managing the narrative. But then Doris said something that shifted everything. Linda's daughter, her name is Amber, she's been at the firm about 2 years. She mentioned that Christine has been discussing your finances at work. Not broadly, but enough. She apparently told a colleague that you had set aside funds for Oliver and Zoe's education, and that these funds would naturally become the family's to manage once, and Amber said she was quoting Christine directly, once the situation was resolved. I set down my pen. Once the situation was resolved. What situation? I was 68 and in good health. I had a house, a retirement account, and a carefully maintained portfolio that Harold and I had built over 40 years. I had no serious illness. I had no intention of requiring care, unless Christine was anticipating a situation that hadn't happened yet, or planning to create one. I called Richard back that afternoon. I told him what Doris had told me. He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. Peggy, he said carefully, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously. Has Danny or Christine, at any point in the last year, raised the topic of your estate planning, your will, power of attorney? I thought about it. And then I remembered a conversation at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when Christine had mentioned, very casually, over the clearing of plates, that she'd read an article about the benefits of families having updated estate documents. She had looked at me when she said it. I had changed the subject. Yes, I said. Once. I want you to review your current will, Richard said, and I want to talk to you about making some changes that clarify your intentions, sooner rather than later. I drove home from that phone call through the cold January streets of Fairfield, past the hardware store and the church where Danny had been baptized, and the library where I had taken him every Saturday until he was 12 years old. The town looked the same as it always had. But something had changed in my understanding of it. This was no longer simply a family disagreement about Christmas dinner. This was about my home, my savings, my grandchildren, my future. And Christine had been planning longer than I had. The second part of the plan required a different kind of courage. Not the quiet, administrative courage of filing paperwork, but the face-to-face kind. I had asked Richard to take two parallel steps. The first was to continue pressing the demand letter. The 30-day response window was now running, and Danny and Christine had retained their own attorney, a man named Philip Voss, who had sent a letter describing my $50,000 contribution as a gift made without expectation of repayment, consistent with the established pattern of parental generosity. I had expected this. Richard had expected it too. That's why we had Marcus Webb. The second step was more delicate. I had reached out to Oliver's school, Jefferson Elementary in Westport, to inquire, as his enrolled emergency contact, which I had been since 2014, about my ability to attend his upcoming winter concert. I had not asked Danny or Christine. I had simply confirmed with the school office that my name remained on file and that I was welcome as a family member to attend public school events. I arrived at Jefferson Elementary on the evening of January 22nd with a small bouquet of sunflowers. Oliver's favorite, I knew, because he had told me so himself in a letter he wrote at summer camp 3 years ago, a letter I had kept. I found a seat near the back. The auditorium was warm and smelled like industrial cleaner and someone's takeout coffee, and the children were filing in from stage left in their holiday concert outfits. I saw Oliver almost immediately. He was in the second row, wearing a white button-down shirt that was slightly too short in the sleeves because boys that age grow so fast, and he was scanning the audience with the particular hopefulness that children have before a performance. When he saw me, his face opened like a window. He waved. A real wave, enthusiastic, the kind children stop doing when they get too self-conscious. I waved back. I did not see Christine's face in that moment, but I heard about it later. She and Danny had been seated 4 rows ahead of me. According to Doris, who heard from Amber, who had been told by a mutual acquaintance who'd also attended, Christine had turned white when she spotted me. She said something to Danny in a low voice. Danny turned around, found me in the crowd, and looked. And this is the detail I keep returning to. Confused. Not angry. Confused. As if my presence at his son's school concert was something he genuinely couldn't locate in any category of expectation. They did not approach me during the event, but in the parking lot afterward, as I was walking to my car with my sunflowers and the small glow of having watched Oliver play recorder beautifully in the back row, Christine stepped in front of me. She was wearing a camel coat, and her expression had the particular compression of a person who has decided to be furious in a controlled way. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Watching my grandson's concert," I said. "He played very well." "You were not invited. School events are open to family members on the emergency contact list," I said. I checked. Danny appeared at her shoulder. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Mom?" he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it for years. Uncertainty. Christine cut over him. "This is harassment." "Attending a school concert is not harassment," I said. "I believe your attorney can confirm that." She took a step closer. Her voice dropped to the register she reserved, I imagined, for negotiations that weren't going her way. You need to understand something, Margaret. We have discussed your behavior with the children's pediatrician. We are building a record. If you continue with this legal nonsense and showing up where you're not wanted, we will pursue a restraining order, and we will use it to make sure you never see those children again. That is not a threat. That is a fact. The cold air between us had gone very still. I looked at her for a moment, at the bright, controlled fury in her face, at Danny standing slightly behind her with his hands in his pockets, looking at the pavement. Then I said, quite calmly, "Thank you for letting me know what you're planning, Christine. I'll pass that along to Richard." I walked to my car. I drove home. I poured myself a glass of red wine, something I almost never did, and I sat in Harold's armchair by the window. My hands were shaking slightly. I want to be honest about that too. Christine's words, "You will never see those children again," had landed somewhere deep in the place where all the real fear lives. Because she might try. She was capable of trying. But she had also, in her anger, made a significant mistake. She had announced her next move out loud in a public parking lot, in front of at least 3 other families who were also walking to their cars. And she had implied that they were already manufacturing documentation against me, which meant, and Richard confirmed this when I called him the next morning, that they were worried. People who are winning don't announce their weapons in parking lots. I gave myself 4 days. 4 days of Doris's cooking and long walks along the Ash Creek and 2 evenings of old movies that Harold and I used to watch. I let the adrenaline settle. I let the fear pass through me, as my mother always said, like weather. Then I went back to work. The offer came through Danny, which told me everything I needed to know about it. He called on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the parking lot encounter, and his voice had the careful, rehearsed quality of someone reading from notes they'd been handed. He said that Christine had been reflecting on the situation, and that they both recognized things had gotten out of hand. He said, and I could hear the exact phrase Christine had given him, that they were open to finding a path forward that worked for everyone. He paused. I let the pause sit. "What does that mean, Danny?" I said. He cleared his throat. "Christine thinks, we think, that maybe we should meet for coffee, the 3 of us. Talk things through, like adults. And the demand letter?" A shorter pause. "She thinks that can be part of the conversation." "The demand letter is a legal matter," I said. "It's being handled through Richard's office. I'm not in a position to discuss it informally." "Mom?" His voice shifted then, and for a moment, just a moment, I heard my son underneath Christine's script. "Don't you want to fix this?" It was a good question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I want a relationship with you and with my grandchildren that is honest, and that doesn't require me to pretend that the last several years didn't happen," I said. "If that's what's on the table, I'm interested. But I'm not going to drop a legitimate legal claim in exchange for being allowed back into the holiday schedule. That's not fixing something. That's me paying again." Silence. "I'll let Christine know," he said finally. I stood at my kitchen window after I hung up and watched a pair of cardinals at my feeder, the red one and the brown one, the male and the female, which Harold used to say was the perfect metaphor for every marriage. And I thought about the specific mathematics of what Christine was offering. The implied deal was this: withdraw the legal claim, accept an informal apology, return to the previous arrangement. Which would mean that the last 4 months had been an expensive lesson in what happens when I cause trouble, and that the correct response was to stop causing trouble. That was not a deal I was going to make. But I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't tempted. Not by Christine's offer, but by the version of it that Danny's voice had briefly suggested. The version where everything went back to the way it was, where I drove to Westport on Christmas morning and handed out gifts and sat at their table and felt for a few hours like I belonged there. I missed my son, not the man who forwarded Christine's decisions as if they were his own. My son. The boy from Birchwood Lane who had called me from college on Sunday evenings and talked for an hour about nothing important. I held that grief for a few minutes. Then I let it pass. The social support I found, as it turned out, was both more organized and more moving than I had expected. Doris had, without telling me, done something quietly brilliant. She had mentioned my situation, in careful, non-identifying terms, to the women in our watercolor class, 3 of whom turned out to have their own versions of the same story. Elaine, who was 73, had spent 4 years being systematically excluded from her grandchildren's lives by a son-in-law who controlled access. Ruth, who was 66, had given her daughter and son-in-law her mother's antique furniture and had watched it sold at an estate sale 2 years later. Carol, who was 70, had been taken off her late husband's investment accounts through a power of attorney that she still wasn't sure she'd fully understood when she signed it. We met at Doris's house on a Thursday evening, the 5 of us, with tea and shortbread, and a frankness that I found both painful and immensely steadying. These were not bitter women. They were practical ones who had learned, as I was learning, that love without documentation is a liability. The thing that Christine is counting on, Elaine said, leaning forward with her cup, is that you care too much to go all the way. That's what they always count on, that we'll stop before the finish line because we don't want to be the kind of mothers who take their children to court. Are you going all the way? Ruth asked me. I thought about Oliver's wave in that school auditorium. I thought about Zoe, who I hadn't held since Easter of the previous year. Yes, I said, I am. Carol nodded slowly. Then let's talk about what else you can do. Over the next hour, they shared contacts, strategies, experiences. Elaine had a granddaughter who was now 19 and had sought her out on her own. They grow up, she said simply. Ruth's situation had been settled through mediation, and she gave me her mediator's name as an alternative option if court became too costly. Carol had connected with a Fairfield County support group for grandparents navigating visitation disputes, and she gave me the coordinator's number. I drove home that night through quiet suburban streets feeling, for the first time in months, that I was not an isolated woman making unreasonable demands. I was one member of a very large, very invisible group of women who had been patient for too long. My patience was over. They came to Birchwood Lane on a Saturday morning in early February, without calling ahead. I was in the kitchen with my second cup of coffee and the crossword when I heard the car in the driveway. The particular sound of Danny's Volvo, which had a slightly loose heat shield that produced a faint rattle on cold mornings. I recognized it before I reached the window. They were both dressed as if they'd made an effort. Danny in the navy wool coat I'd given him 3 Christmases ago. Christine in a dark blazer, her hair neatly arranged. Oliver and Zoe were not with them. That registered immediately. They had come without the children, which meant this was not a reconciliation visit. This was a meeting. I opened the door before they knocked. Danny, Christine. I stepped back to let them in, because turning family away at the door is not who I am, even now. I don't have much time this morning, but come in. Christine's eyes moved around the kitchen, registering, cataloging, in the way that real estate agents assess a space. Then she smiled, warm, practiced, and about 3 degrees too wide to be sincere. Peggy, she said, using the nickname for the first time I could remember. "We've been so worried about you." I poured them coffee without being asked, kept my hands busy, kept my face calm. We sat at the table where I had done Danny's homework with him for 12 years, and Christine arranged herself with the posture of someone who has prepared for a conversation. Danny sat next to her and looked at the table with the air of a man who has agreed to be somewhere without fully agreeing to what might happen there. "We should have come sooner," Christine began. "This whole situation, the letter, the attorney. I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding. The money, Margaret, the 50,000. Danny and I never saw that as a loan. You were so generous. We both understood it as your gift to us, to the family. We never would have accepted it otherwise." "Marcus Webb was in the room when Harold and I discussed the terms," I said. Christine's smile stayed in place. "Marcus, bless him. He's 81 years old, Peggy. I don't think a court is going to put a great deal of weight on the memory of an 81-year-old man." I noted, without showing that I noted it, that she had just dismissed a witness. In front of a former bookkeeper who was keeping track of everything. "I hear you," I said. "I'll let Richard know your position." Danny looked up then. "Mom, can we put the lawyers aside for a second? This is tearing the family apart." His voice was genuine in a way that hurt. "I know things have been hard. I know Christine and I haven't always gotten it right. But Zoe cried last week because she didn't get to see you at Christmas. She's 7 years old, and she cried." The Zoe detail landed precisely where it was intended to land. I took a slow sip of coffee. "I'd like very much to see Zoe," I said. "I've been asking to see both children for months." "And that can happen," Christine said smoothly, picking up his thread with the coordination of a practice team. "As soon as we resolve this misunderstanding, you withdraw the legal claim, we work out a schedule, real, regular access, holidays, birthdays, and we move forward. Everybody wins." There it was, the offer again, dressed up this time in Zoe's tears. "What happens to the claim if I don't withdraw it?" I asked. Christine's expression shifted, just slightly. The warmth dialed down 1 degree. "Well," she said, "it becomes adversarial. And when things become adversarial, they become unpredictable. Courts look at the whole picture. The children's stability, their school routines, the stress of contested visitation on young kids. Judges take that seriously." She paused. "It would be a shame for Oliver and Zoe to have to feel like they were caught in the middle." Let me be clear about what she had just done. She had sat in my kitchen, in the house where I raised her husband, and she had suggested, wrapped in reasonable, regretful language, that she would use the children as leverage if I continued to pursue my legal rights. I set my coffee cup down. "I understand what you're describing," I said. "I want you both to understand something in return. I am not doing this because I am angry, or because I am going through something, or because I have misunderstood the nature of our arrangement. I am doing this because I have documentation of a pattern that I allowed to continue for too long, because I was afraid of exactly this conversation." Christine's face had gone still. "I love my son," I continued. "I love my grandchildren. That is why I am not withdrawing. Because what I am protecting is not $50,000. What I am protecting is my right to be a real presence in those children's lives. Not a figure who can be managed and excluded at your discretion. A grandmother. And if it takes a court to establish that, then that is what it will take." Danny opened his mouth. Christine put her hand on his arm. "I think," she said, and her voice had lost its warmth entirely now, "that you are making a very serious mistake." "I've made notes of this conversation," I said. "Date, time, who was present. Richard will have it this afternoon." They left 7 minutes later. Danny paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Something between sorrow and apology, and something else. Something more complicated that I didn't have a name for yet. When the Volvo backed out of the driveway, I stood at the kitchen window and breathed. My hands were not quite steady. Christine's phrase, "When things become adversarial, they become unpredictable," had done its work. There was fear, real fear. The kind that comes not from a single threat, but from the recognition that the person threatening you is intelligent and organized and has no intention of stopping. But here is what I also knew. Fear, in the right hands, is a compass. It points directly at what matters. I called Richard at noon and told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Peggy, I think it's time for the second filing." The grandparent visitation petition was filed on February the 19th. Richard had prepared it meticulously, citing Connecticut General Statute Section 46B-59, documenting the systematic reduction in my contact with Oliver and Zoe from 2019 to the present, including the dated correspondence, the canceled visits, the Christmas exclusion text, and the parking lot confrontation witnessed by at least 4 other adults whose names and contact information I had, because I had spent an afternoon after the school concert quietly introducing myself to 3 of the other parents who had been nearby and explaining briefly and factually what had just occurred. I had also, on Richard's advice, written letters, proper letters with dates sent by certified mail, to Oliver and Zoe for every occasion since Christmas. Birthday cards, Valentine's Day, a note on the first day of February just to say I was thinking of them, not to create a paper trail, because I missed them. But the paper trail existed, regardless of intent. The first court date was set for March the 5th. A preliminary hearing, not a trial, a structured conversation before a family court judge to determine whether mediation was appropriate or whether the matter would proceed to formal proceedings. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy blue, which Harold always said made me look like I meant business. Pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I arrived at the Fairfield County Courthouse with Richard at 8:45, 15 minutes early, because I am a woman who is always 15 minutes early. Danny and Christine arrived at 8:58 with Philip Voss, who was younger than I expected and had the slightly aggressive confidence of an attorney who had never lost in front of a family court judge and had not yet encountered one who disagreed with him. We were assigned to a conference room first. Standard practice in family matters, Richard told me, where the judge's clerk facilitated a preliminary exchange. Christine sat across the table from me in a charcoal blazer, composed and precise. Danny sat beside her. He had not looked at me directly since walking in. Philip Voss opened. The $50,000 contribution was, he stated, a gift. He cited family members who would testify to Peggy's established pattern of generous gifting to the family over many years. He questioned the reliability of Marcus Webb. He suggested that my pursuit of a visitation petition was indicative of a family relationship that had become strained and contentious, and that the source of that strain was, in his framing, my behavior. He was good. I'll give him that. Then Richard presented our documentation, bank transfer records, the verbal loan agreement, and Marcus Webb's written statement, which had been notarized and delivered to the court. Dated correspondence showing the progressive restriction of my access to the grandchildren. The parking lot incident, corroborated by written statements from 2 of the parents who had witnessed it. And this is the thing I am proudest of, and which cost me nothing except the habit of a lifetime of careful record-keeping. A complete chronological log of every visit with Oliver and Zoe from 2017 to 2023, compared against a calendar of family events from which I had been excluded. When Richard placed that calendar on the table, something changed in the room. Christine's attorney reached for it first. He reviewed it in silence. Then he showed it to Christine. I watched her read it, and I watched the exact moment when she realized the scope of what was in front of her. Not just a dispute about Christmas, but a 7-year documented record of a systematic pattern. "This is not," she began. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge's clerk said firmly, "please let counsel respond." Philip Voss asked for a recess. We took 20 minutes. When we reconvened, there was a new quality to the room. Philip had spoken to Christine, and Christine's composure had a different texture. Tighter, more brittle. The composure of someone controlling something that wanted to come apart. It was during the second session that it happened. Philip Voss, perhaps feeling the ground shifting, tried to reframe the entire narrative. He suggested that my campaign, his word, of legal action and school appearances and certified letters had been psychologically distressing for the grandchildren. That Christine had sought advice from Oliver and Zoe's pediatrician. That there were concerns about my stability. Richard looked at me briefly. I gave him the smallest nod. He produced a single page, a printout of a text message exchange, not between me and anyone, between Christine and Danny from the December 22nd, when Danny sent me the exclusion text. It had been sent to me by Danny himself 3 weeks earlier. He had not told Christine he'd done it. The exchange read, in part, Danny texting Christine asking, "Are you sure about this? She's their grandmother." And Christine responding, "Do it. Send exactly what I wrote. Don't change anything." And then, after the message to me had been sent, "Good. Now she'll either fall in line or give us the excuse we need." The excuse they needed. For what? Richard answered that question by placing the second document on the table. A printout of a conversation Amber at Christine's real estate office had provided. A conversation in which Christine had told a colleague, in plain language, that Peggy Holloway had significant assets and was not getting any younger, and that if things went as planned, the family would have control of those assets within the year. The room was very quiet. Christine stood up. "That is completely taken out of context. Mrs. Holloway, she is lying. That woman has always been—" "Christine," Danny's voice. She stopped. He was looking at the text message printout. The one where she had written, "Don't change anything." The one where she had written, "Give us the excuse we need." "Danny," she said sharply, "don't—" "I sent her that printout," he said quietly to the room. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences I have ever sat inside. Christine turned to look at her husband, and I watched something pass between them that had been building, I suspected, for years. Not love, not hatred. Something more tired than either. My son looked across the table at me. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." The hearing did not end that morning. These things never do. But the ground had shifted so completely that what followed over the next 6 weeks was less a legal battle than a structured unwinding of a position that could no longer hold. Christine retained Philip Voss through the end of the proceedings, but the dynamic had changed. Attorneys read the room, and Philip began filing his documents with a certain distance from his client's instructions. The text message evidence, combined with Amber's formal deposition, created a situation in which Christine's credibility was genuinely compromised. Marcus Webb, 81 years old and sharp as he had ever been, delivered his statement with the confident precision of a man who had spent 40 years in contracting, where a verbal agreement carried exactly the same weight as a written one if you remembered it clearly. He remembered everything: the color of the kitchen table, what Harold had been drinking, Danny's exact words, "We'll pay it back, Marcus. Give us 7 years to get on our feet." A judge found the weight of evidence sufficient to conclude that the $50,000 transfer had been a loan, not a gift. In April, a consent order was entered, requiring Daniel and Christine Holloway to repay the $50,000 plus 6 years of applicable interest within 18 months. The total came to $61,200. The grandparent visitation order followed shortly after. The family court judge reviewed the documentation and issued an order providing for regular contact with Oliver and Zoe, 1 weekend per month, alternating major holidays, and 2 weeks in summer. The order noted explicitly that the documented pattern of exclusion had not served the children's best interests, and that ongoing interference with the schedule would constitute contempt of court. Christine's attorney filed 2 objections. Both were denied. But the most significant thing that happened in those 6 weeks did not happen in a courtroom. Danny came to Birchwood Lane alone on a Thursday evening in late March. He called ahead, which was new. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. He told me that Christine had been tracking my finances in ways he hadn't fully understood until he saw the documents in that conference room. He told me the Christmas exclusion had been entirely Christine's decision, and that he had sent the text because she had been standing beside him, and he hadn't known how to refuse. "I knew it was wrong the second I hit send," he said. "That's why I kept those texts for 3 weeks." Then I thought about what Dad would have said. I looked at my son across Harold's table and thought about how much a person can love someone while also being devastated by them. How both things are true at once, without either canceling out the other. "Whatever you decide about your marriage," I said, "my relationship with you and the children is separate from it. That's not going to be Christine's decision anymore." On the first weekend in April, Oliver met me at the door and wrapped both arms around me in the fervent way that children hug when they have missed someone and didn't know how to say so. Zoe hung back slightly, then said with great seriousness, "Grandma Peggy, I saved you some of my Halloween candy." It was April. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in months," I told her. The 3 of us walked to the park. Oliver showed me a card trick. Zoe made me the chief guest at an imaginary tea party, using sticks and bottle caps as props. I sat on a cold park bench in early April sunlight and understood, in the wordless way that some things can only be understood, that this was what I had been fighting for all along. Not the money, not the legal victory, satisfying as it was. A stick, a bottle cap, a child pouring imaginary tea with enormous ceremony. I accepted the cup with both hands. By the time autumn came to Fairfield County, my life had changed in ways I was still occasionally surprised by. The visitation schedule was working. Every 3rd weekend, Oliver and Zoe arrived on Birchwood Lane with overnight bags and the energy of children who know they are going somewhere they are genuinely wanted. Oliver, 12 now and deep in early adolescence, had taken to sitting at the kitchen table after dinner and talking to me about history and a detective novel series he'd discovered. Zoe had claimed Harold's old armchair as hers and spent her visiting hours drawing elaborate maps of imaginary countries with their own capitals and exports. I had resumed watercolor classes. Doris and I walked every Tuesday and Thursday morning along Ash Creek, 3 miles, regardless of weather. In September, I booked a trip to Savannah, somewhere I had always wanted to go and spent decades finding reasons to postpone. I went alone. I walked the squares, ate shrimp and grits, and sat beneath Spanish moss with a book from a shop on Bull Street, feeling the particular lightness of a person who has stopped waiting for permission to take up space in the world. The $61,000 was repaid in full by the following spring in scheduled installments that arrived on time without reminder. As for Christine and Danny, I am not a woman who wishes people ill, but I am a woman who keeps accurate records, and the record of what followed was neither surprising nor, in the deepest part of my honest self, entirely unwelcome. The marriage did not survive the year. Danny told me in November that Christine had asked for a divorce. The counseling had clarified rather than resolved things. Christine relocated to a condo in Stamford. Several Westport acquaintances had been near that courthouse during the proceedings, and this is a small county where information moves efficiently. She did not tell many people what had actually happened. But silence, in such communities, is its own communication. Danny rented an apartment in Fairfield, closer to his job and closer to Birchwood Lane. We had dinners occasionally now, not every week, but regularly enough to feel like a rhythm. He was in therapy. He was slowly, imperfectly, learning to occupy his own opinions. I was cautious with him because I had learned the cost of giving trust on credit. He was earning it back, installment by installment, and that seemed right. I turned 70 in November. Doris brought a cake. Oliver performed a card trick as a birthday entertainment and almost got it right. Zoe gave me a watercolor painting. Bright, wobbly, completely abstract. Made in secret with Doris's help. I framed it and hung it in the kitchen between the window and the photograph of Harold. Looking at it one morning over coffee, I thought, this is what was worth protecting. Not the money, not the judgment, the frame on the wall, the child who made it, the room they know they are welcome in. I had protected it, and it was real. Looking back, the hardest moment wasn't the text message, or the parking lot, or the courtroom. It was midnight at my kitchen table, deciding not to accept what I'd been handed. I learned this. Dignity cannot be taken from you, but it can be surrendered quietly, one accommodation at a time, if you stop paying attention. So I ask you, what would you have done? Because you are worth the fight. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening. Peggy.